Hello, this is Jim, and I've got a smaller kit set up here with a 20-inch bass drum. And what we're going to do today is try a few different head combinations on the bass drum. Throughout this year, with my band, we played several gigs using other people's drum sets. And there were a few that had smaller bass drums that had a really good sound. And this sort of inspired me to change the batter head on my own bass drum. So today we're going to evaluate some different sounds and see which one sounds the best. So here's the drum set that we're going to be using. It's a Ludwig drum set. It's got a 20-inch bass drum, Monroe 14 by 20-inch bass drum. It's got a Monroe 10-inch rack tom and the trusty 16-inch Slingerland floor tom. As far as the heads go, the current configuration is an Evans EQ3 head for a reso head, and it's got a kick port on it. And then if we go around the back, we can see that there's also an Evans EQ3 head, and it's got a felt strip on it. There's also a piece of moleskin on it that's well worn through. The head's been on there for over 20 years. The replacement head that we're going to use on the batter side is an Evans EMED heavyweight drum head. And then in order to optimize this sound, here I have the original reso head for the bass drum. So what we're going to try is a few different combinations. We'll try having the EQ3 head with the kick port on the reso, and we'll try no reso head, and then we'll try the original wide open reso head. As far as microphones go, we have a Shure Beta 52A on the bass drum. We have a Shure SM57 on the snare drum. Then we have two AKG Perception 220s for overheads. And far out in the room, 20 feet away for the room mic, we have an AKG Perception 420 that's set in Omni mode. Now this setup that we're using to record the drums today is really good setup for demoing purposes for the band that I'm in. It's not really a substitute for going to a real studio with a proper room and with, 15 microphones on the drum set, but it gives us a really good sound for demoing purposes. All right, and we've got some dogs barking upstairs, but I just played the first take, and you can see this is the original Evans EQ3 batter with the felt strip. Okay, so now we've got the new batter head on, and you can see it's an Evans EMED heavyweight. I started right out with the big ring because I find that that's almost always what I want. And I'm just going to hit this a few times with the mallet. You can see that usually with these, I don't have them very tight. I just get all the wrinkles out, and you can see I've been hitting it with the mallet. So I'm going to hit it with the mallet a couple times. So I'm going to hit it with the mallet just to show you how I tuned it up. And I just, I usually like it pretty loose. All right, so at this point, I've applied the little sticker, which goes under the beater. I use a wooden beater, and I made a few tuning adjustments. now what I've done is I've taken off the reso head and I've set up the mic the way I usually set it up in my other larger bass drums, that, with a reso head, but without the reso head. So basically it's just a little bit off center and a few inches away from the batter head. And there's nothing in there other than the muffling that comes standard with the EMAD heavyweight. So at this point in the video, we're going to go through all of the bass drum head combination options back to back so you can really hear the difference. Hopefully you've been listening with high quality headphones the entire time in the video, but if you haven't, you should do that now. I do want to mention a little bit about the treatment of the microphone tracks. So the room microphone has some pretty heavy compression and reverb on it. So when we go through the options, I'll first do it without the room mic and then with the room mic on. For the other tracks, they all have just a little bit of EQ that I would normally apply, and they're consistent across all of the different options. For the bass drum mic only, I did do a few EQ tweaks, just really checking things to make sure I was getting the best out of each sound. But they're very, very close in terms of the EQ. For the levels, I noticed afterwards that the first two options that had the kick port on the resonant head had a significantly higher level coming in than the other two. It would have been better if I had checked levels between each of the takes. So what I did sort of naturally, even before I noticed, is those two options are backed off on the gain a little bit for the bass drum mic. And then for the other two options, I've got the gain actually boosted a little bit to compensate for that. So that's really the effects. Now we're going to go through all the back-to-back options. So we'll have quarter note bass drum hits, both without and with the room mic, and then we'll just go through sections of the beat that I was playing with all of the microphones in play. So at this point in the video, we've gone through all of the options back to back. And at the outset of the video, I said we're going to choose which one sounded the best. And I think that that's sort of a trick question, right? Because all of the options to me sounded good, and I think it really depends on the musical context which one anyone might choose for their particular situation. Some of the observations I had initially were, the first one was that the first two options, which both had the EQ3 resonant head, those two options sounded more similar to one another than I might have expected at the outset. And I think the reason was when, the first option that had the EQ3 batter head also had the felt strip, which provided additional dampening compared to using the EQ3 on its own. So if I were to redo this again, I would probably remove that felt strip before starting to get the pure EQ3 sound. But that felt strip provided dampening, which makes it more similar to the EMAD head option. So those were more similar. I do think, however, that the EMAD did deliver darker tone as advertised, right? The EMAD head is supposed to deliver a darker tone, and I didn't really make any effort to do an apples to apples exact tuning or anything like that. But where it landed, if you listen to those two options back to back, certainly the EMAD has a darker tone, and I think it delivers on what's advertised. Another observation was the option with no resonant head really reminded me of like a Tower of Power Back to Oakland sound, where you have a small bass drum and it's really, really dead. There's almost no sustain at all. And that option could be good for like a really busy funk application or something like that. The full resonant head, that option, it has some overtones that sound, when you listen to the drums in isolation, that kind of sound like you're bouncing a basketball, that might be undesirable. But that option I like that drum sound. It reminds me of when I was a kid and learning the drums, and the drum set that my teacher had no muffling on the bass drum, had a small bass drum, and it just kind of warms my heart. And I think there are good applications for that kind of a sound. There were some options that we did not test that if I were to do this again, I might test. So having the resonant head with a small port, with a small hole in it, the option that we tested, we didn't have any additional muffling. So the other option I might have tested would be to put a small blanket inside the bass drum and just provide a little bit of additional dampening beyond what is provided on the EMAD batter head. And that sort of would bring you, it would keep a little bit of sustain, but be more controlled, right? So that's a good option to test. And in fact, when I tune my larger bass drums, and almost all of my bass drums, I have a little blanket in there, like this bass drum. The batter head, or the resonant head rather, has no muffling on it, and then there's a blanket in there that's against the batter head. And a nice thing about that is that kind of an option is that if you get to a gig and it's too much, you can wiggle the blanket around against the front head and make it a very dead option as well. So if we sort of analyze this, there's a spectrum, right? There's one end of the spectrum where you have very defined attack and short sustain, like the zero resonant head option. And then there's another end of the spectrum where you have a full resonant head and there's less attack and a long sustain. So which option you would choose would really depend on the musical context. And it matters what the drums sound like with a band or with the music that you're playing along to. It doesn't really matter what they sound like in isolation. So the short, sustain, high attack end of the spectrum is very good when you're playing very busy patterns on the bass drum, perhaps, or where there's a lot of instruments and a lot going on in the music, and you just need a sound that cuts through but doesn't take up a lot of space in the mix. So I think of, with the busy stuff, and, I think of something like Metallica and Justice for All, where you have very busy, heavy metal, really defined bass drum sound. Again, back to Oakland, Tower of Power, funk, you've got a lot of instruments going on. You don't want to take up a lot of space. The patterns are pretty busy. So those sounds are sort of good in those situations. In the other end of the spectrum, where you have less attack and you have high sustain or long sustain, right? That sort of a sound, I think, works better where there are fewer instruments involved and there's a ton of space in the music. The one that comes to mind, there's a band called The Dead Weather, where Jack White's playing drums, right? And some of their songs, they've just got an enormous amount of space that allows for a huge, very resonant, very sustained bass drum sound. The nice thing about having a ported resonant head is that it sort of provides a happy medium where the porthole sort of relieves some of the resonance, and so you don't get quite so much sustain. It doesn't sound like you're bouncing a basketball, but you do get some sustain out of the drum and some tone out of the drum. And again, if you have a blanket inside the drum and you're playing in a live situation, you can, or even in the studio, you can move that blanket around to achieve various levels of dampening, which is what I really like to do. I think a final consideration that is critically important is if you're playing live, right? So one of the big things at the beginning, we're testing a 20-inch bass drum here, which is a small bass drum, and it's not moving a ton of air. If you're playing live, I think the most important consideration is volume. The smaller bass drums are going to have less volume, and the deader options are going to have a lot less volume, right? So if you're mic'd, you don't really have to worry about the volume, and the fact that the bass drum is mic'd will take care of that for you, right? At the beginning of the video, I mentioned that last year our band played several gigs where there was a smaller bass drum that another band or a club provided to us, and in those situations they all erred towards really sort of a dead tuning, and they were all mic'd. So if you were going to play rock music at a club and the drums weren't going to be mic'd, I would not recommend showing up necessarily with a 20-inch bass drum with no resonant head, right? I would go for a larger, like this is a 22-inch bass drum, and have some flexibility in the sound you can get out of it, but make sure you can get the volume that you need if that's necessary. So those are the final thoughts. If you've gotten to the end of this video, I thank you very much for watching the video. I was doing this anyway. I was planning on changing the batter head on this bass drum, and I thought it would be really fun to record it and have these options available in case it helps anybody else out there. So, hopefully you enjoyed the video, and I certainly had a great time making it. Thank you very much.